Portland, Oregon, November 15th, 2022. On that cold night of November 15th, 2022, the streets of Portland were covered in a fine fog. The wet sidewalks reflected the streetlights, creating a silent and almost melancholic atmosphere. Emma Collins drove through the city, the sound of her windshield wipers breaking the silence inside the car. The 23-year-old had returned home early after canceling a dinner with her friends. An ordinary night, she thought, but what awaited her would change her life forever. Emma had an organized routine. A biology student at the University of Portland, she lived with her father, Richard Collins, a 48-year-old man, a widower since her mother died when she was still a teenager. The bond between father and daughter became unbreakable after the loss of her mother. Furthermore, Emma was dating Jake Turner, a man 5 years older, charismatic, and who seemed to be the perfect partner. Richard and Jake seemed to get along really well, which made her even more confident that everything in her life was on the right track. When Emma walked into the house that night, something seemed different. The lights downstairs were off, and the silence was unusual. There was only a dim light upstairs, coming from his father's office. The house, which normally seemed welcoming, was strangely gloomy. Emma, still holding her bag, hesitated for a moment in the hallway. Something inside her warned her that something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Determined to find out what was going on, Emma slowly climbed the stairs. With every step he took, the silence became more suffocating. When he reached the top of the stairs, he noticed that the office door was barely open, and from inside, low voices could be heard. One of the voices was unmistakable. It was Jake. His heart sped up. What was he doing there so late? He hadn't mentioned anything about visiting his father that night. Feeling a mix of curiosity and discomfort, Emma approached the door without making a sound. She pushed the door lightly with her hand, just enough to get a clear view of what was happening inside the office. What she saw, however, made the blood in her veins freeze. Jake was sitting on the couch, next to his father, Richard. It wasn't the common closeness between two friends or acquaintances. There was something more there, something Emma couldn't immediately understand. The air in the room seemed thick with tension, but it wasn't a nervous tension. It was something intimate, something Emma would never imagine witnessing between her boyfriend and her father. Shock ran through his body like lightning. Her eyes widened, and she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Richard and Jake didn't see her at the door. They were too distracted, laughing about something she couldn't understand, but the tone of the conversation and the way they looked at each other made it clear to Emma there was something going on between them, something she shouldn't have discovered. She felt betrayed in every way possible by the man she loved and the father she trusted most. With her heart racing and unable to bear the sight any longer, Emma retreated silently, closing the door slowly so as not to be noticed. She was in shock, almost out of breath, feeling tears burning her eyes as she quickly descended the stairs. Her legs were shaking, and she could barely keep her balance. All she wanted was to get out of that house, to escape that reality. Upon reaching her room, Emma locked the door and fell to the floor, leaning against the wall. Silent tears streamed down her face as she tried, in vain, to process what she had just seen. How was that possible? Jake, the man she had planned a future with, was involved with her own father. The betrayal was devastating, not only as a girlfriend, but as a daughter. She felt suffocated by the pain and anger that was beginning to build within her. Emma stood there, motionless, as her mind raced. All the recent moments started to make sense. Jake's apologies, the strange looks between him and Richard, the way they both seemed closer than usual. She hated herself for not realizing it sooner, for not seeing the signs. But now, the truth was there, naked and raw. At that moment, something inside Emma began to transform. The pain of betrayal soon gave way to something darker, a feeling she had never experienced before. She wanted answers, she wanted justice. But most of all, he wanted revenge. And there, sitting in the dark of her room, Emma knew that her life would never be the same. 2 days have passed since that night. Emma could barely sleep. The scenes she witnessed in her father's office tormented her every second. She had locked herself in her room ever since, avoiding any contact with Richard or Jake. Deep down, she knew she would need to face that situation at some point, but fear and anger consumed her. On the morning of November 17th, Emma decided that she could no longer live with that anguish. She needed answers. The silence in the house seemed deafening. His father had left for work early, and Jake hadn't shown up since the incident. Emma took that moment to try to organize her thoughts. Sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of cold coffee in her hands, she rehearsed the words she would say. Part of her still didn't believe what she had discovered, but another part wanted to confront them, make them pay for it. She picked up the phone and, after taking a deep breath, decided to call Jake. His hand shook as he entered the number. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again, but nothing. Having decided, she sent a simple but tense message. "We need to talk. Come to my house as soon as possible." A few hours passed before Jake finally responded, saying he would be there in 30 minutes. Emma didn't know what to expect. Anger pulsed through her veins, but she also knew she needed to control herself. She wanted to hear him, wanted to know how far that betrayal extended. As he waited, his heart beat faster and faster, his anxiety increasing by the minute. Jake arrived exactly 30 minutes later. He walked through the front door with the same confidence as always, but there was something different in his gaze. Emma watched him for a few seconds before saying anything. He looked uncomfortable, like he knew something was wrong but didn't know exactly what. "What is it, Emma?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a hint of tension in his voice. Emma looked at him, controlling the fury building inside her. She took a deep breath before finally releasing the words that were consuming her. "I know what's going on, Jake." Jake froze for a moment. His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly tried to compose himself. "What are you talking about?" He tried to sound confused, but the nervous tone in his voice gave it away. Emma stood up from her chair, facing him head-on. Her heart was racing, but she knew she couldn't hesitate. The truth was about to be revealed. "I saw you with my father," she said, the words coming out with a mixture of disgust and anger. "In the office, 2 days ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake went pale. He knew there was no more hiding it. His eyes wavered, and he looked away, running a hand through his hair, clearly trying to think of a way out of the situation. Jake started, but his voice trailed off. "How long has this been going on?" Emma's voice was firm, but filled with pain. She wanted an answer, and she wouldn't accept lies. Jake took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a second before finally responding. "A few months ago," he admitted, guilt written all over his face. I didn't plan any of this. It just happened." "Did it just happen?" Emma almost laughed nervously. "You're sleeping with my dad, Jake. The man who trusted you most." Jake lowered his head, unable to look at Emma. She had never felt so angry in her entire life. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to do something, anything, but she controlled herself. There were still more questions, more things she needed to understand. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her voice beginning to waver. "I trusted you. I loved you." Jake remained silent, unable to justify his actions. Emma knew that nothing he said could make amends for what had happened. The betrayal went far beyond a simple affair. It was a violation of trust on every level. Before Jake could say anything else, the front door opened. Richard had arrived. When he walked in and saw the scene, he immediately realized something was wrong. Emma's gaze glared at him, and he froze in the middle of the room. "Dad, we need to talk," Emma said, her voice sharp as a knife. "Now." Richard hesitated, but he knew he couldn't get away from it. He looked at Jake, and the exchange of glances between them only made Emma's stomach turn even more. She pointed to the sofa, indicating that they should both sit down. She had no intention of making things easier for either of them. "I know everything," Emma said bluntly. "I know you are together. I know they've been lying to me." Richard and Jake remained silent. Emma felt a deep hatred rise within her. How could they do this? And for so long? Do you think this is normal? Emma asked, her voice now filled with indignation. You betrayed me in every way possible. What am I to you? Nothing? Richard tried to speak, but Emma interrupted him, having no patience for excuses. You owe me explanations. And more than that, they owe me respect. Silence fell again, but this time, Emma knew this was the beginning of the end. From that moment on, nothing would be the same as before. That night, after the intense revelation, Emma could barely breathe properly. The fury she felt inside her was like a relentless wave, destroying everything she believed to be real. She locked herself in her room and let her mind run wild, fueled by hatred. Richard and Jake had left the house in silence, knowing that what they had done was unforgivable. But for Emma, that wouldn't be the end. It was just the beginning. By the next morning, November 18th, the anger had turned into something colder and more calculated. Emma knew she couldn't just let this betrayal go. It wasn't enough to just confront them. They needed to pay. The pain that consumed her would not be soothed by empty apologies or tears of regret. She wanted more. She wanted them to feel the same suffering she felt. Emma spent hours turning over her thoughts, thinking of every possible way to get revenge. There was a part of her that still felt lost, trying to find some logical solution to what happened. But the other, darker part was the one in control now. The desire for revenge took over, and that's when she came up with the plan. Contrary to what her father and Jake thought, Emma was not fragile. She was always observant, attentive to details. During those months, without even realizing it, she had put together several pieces that now made sense. The strange encounters between the two, the father's unexpected trips, Jake's excuses. She had all the information she needed. And now, I just needed to act. First, she began to plot how she would manipulate them both into falling into her trap. It wouldn't be difficult. Both Richard and Jake were vulnerable. They knew that Emma could destroy their lives with a single word, and that scared them. She would use that fear against them. He would manipulate their insecurities and the guilt they carried to push them over the edge. The first step of her plan was simple: make them both believe that she could forgive them, that their relationship could be saved. Emma knew that both Richard and Jake would do anything to avoid a scandal or lose control over the situation. She would use this to her advantage. Later that afternoon, Emma decided to text Jake. Her hand shook slightly, but the feeling of power kept her focused. The message was short but calculated. We need to talk. Come to my father's house tonight. I have a solution. Jake responded quickly, confirming he would be there. She knew he wouldn't refuse. Soon after, Emma sent a message to her father, Richard, asking him to be home that night. She used the right words, playing on the guilt she knew he was feeling. As expected, Richard also agreed. Everything was going according to plan. As night fell over Portland, fog began to form again on the city streets, just like the night it all began. Emma was preparing herself for what would be the big confrontation. His heart was beating fast, but this time, it wasn't out of fear or pain. It was the adrenaline rush of being in control. The power she now had over the two men who had destroyed her trust kept her firm in her decision. Jake was the first to arrive. He entered Richard's house unceremoniously, as he always did, but this time the air was different. He seemed suspicious, looking around, as if he sensed something was wrong. Emma was waiting for him in the living room, sitting on a chair in the corner of the room. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected the storm that was about to unfold. Emma, Jake began, hesitantly. Sit down, she said, pointing to the couch in front of her. Emma's voice was firm, emotionless. Jake complied, slowly sitting down, as Richard walked through the door shortly after. He also noticed the tension in the air, but tried to remain calm. What is happening? Richard asked, looking at Emma and then at Jake as if searching for answers. Emma looked at the two of them for a moment, letting silence dominate the room. She wanted them to feel the weight of what was about to happen. Then, finally, he began to speak. I've been thinking a lot these past few days, she said, looking directly at Jake. I thought about everything that happened, how you betrayed me. Richard and Jake exchanged nervous glances, but remained silent. I tried to understand why you would do something like that to me, Emma continued, her voice cold and calculated. And I realized there is no excuse. But I also realized that there's no point in just being angry. This won't get me anywhere. The two men looked relieved for a brief moment, as if Emma was about to forgive them. But then, his expression changed, and the ice in his eyes intensified. So I decided I'm going to solve this another way, she said, getting up slowly. I don't want you in my life anymore. But before you leave, I want you to pay for what you did. What are you saying, Emma? Richard asked nervously. She smiled, a dark smile that made both men cower on the couch. Do you think you can just go on with your lives after what you did? She asked, now more aggressive. Do you think you can get away with this? Jake tried to speak, but Emma interrupted him. I won't let you get away with it. This ends today. What they didn't know was that Emma had planned everything perfectly. In the next few minutes, Richard and Jake's fate would be sealed. She had already plotted the next step in her revenge, and what was to come would be nothing short of devastating. The clock in the living room said 9 p.m. The night was silent, and the only light that illuminated the room came from the ceiling lamps, creating shadows that danced on the walls. Emma was standing, her expression impassive, while Richard and Jake were on the sofa, both nervous and restless. She had calculated every move, every word, and was ready to carry out her plan. The air was thick with palpable tension. Emma had prepared a meticulously thought-out scenario. I knew I couldn't just confront them and expect them to feel guilty. For her, justice needed to be more concrete, more tangible. And so she decided to use fear to manipulate the situation in her favor. Emma walked over to the coffee table, where she had placed a small black box. His eyes turned to Jake and Richard, observing them coldly. I don't want you in my life anymore, Emma said, her voice full of determination. And I will make you feel the weight of what you did. Jake and Richard exchanged worried looks, trying to understand what Emma had in mind. Richard stood up, taking a step towards Emma. Emma, please don't do this. Let's talk, he said, his voice desperate. Emma ignored him, focusing her attention on the black box on the table. She slowly opened it, revealing a small gun. The sight of the gun made Richard and Jake's eyes widen. They were not prepared for this. Emma had made it clear that the situation was out of control. What are you going to do with it? Jake asked, his voice shaking. Emma smiled, a smile that wasn't one of joy, but one of dark satisfaction. She had planned every detail, and now it was time to put her plan into action. I just want you to understand what you're up against, Emma said, approaching the table. You thought you could get away with it. They thought they could fool me and still go on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Richard tried to get closer, but Emma raised the gun, causing him to stop abruptly. She didn't intend to use the gun, at least not yet. Her presence, with the gun in hand, was enough to cause the panic she was looking for. Emma, please don't do this. We can solve this another way, Richard pleaded, his voice full of fear. How? Emma asked, the tone of her voice sharp. How do you think you can resolve this now? The truth is that there is no solution for what they did. You've crossed a line, and now you need to pay. Emma sat down again, with the gun still in her hands, and the two men continued to sit, paralyzed. Fear was evident on their faces. Emma had managed to create an environment of tension and panic that they could not control. What followed was a conversation full of accusations and justifications. Richard and Jake tried to explain their actions, but Emma wasn't interested in their excuses. She knew nothing could repair the pain she felt. What she wanted now was to make sure they understood the cost of their actions. As the night progressed, Emma began to realize that her plan was working. The feeling of control she had sought was coming to fruition. Richard and Jake were completely at the mercy of their decisions. Emma knew it was time to take the next step. You will pay for what you did, Emma said, her voice firm. Not because I want to, but because it's necessary. I can't just let this go. I need you to understand the gravity of what you did. With those words, Emma stood up and picked up the black box, placing it back on the table. She watched the two men, still in shock, and decided it was time to give an ultimatum. "I'm going to give you a choice," Emma said, her voice carrying an implacable tone. "You have until tomorrow to leave the city and never appear in my life again. If you don't comply, I guarantee you will spend most of your life behind bars." Richard and Jake's eyes filled with fear. Emma had given a clear and direct ultimatum. She didn't just want them to leave. She wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, even if it was only in the form of a threat. Silence once again dominated the room. Richard and Jake were in shock, unable to respond. Emma knew the night had been a success in terms of manipulation and control. She had managed to impose her will on both of them, forcing them to face the consequences of their actions in ways they had not anticipated. As the dawn progressed, Emma prepared to end the confrontation. She didn't need to do anything anymore. The fear she had created had already served its purpose. Richard and Jake were devastated, and come dawn, they would do whatever was necessary to escape the situation. Emma had made them pay one way or another. The night was almost over. Emma watched the two men leave the house, looks of defeat on their faces. She knew that from that moment on, her life would never be the same. What she had gone through that night had transformed her from a victim to someone who was now in control. And although the future was still uncertain, Emma knew it marked the end of a dark chapter in her life. As the house filled with early morning silence, Emma looked out the window and watched the city of Portland begin to wake up. She felt strangely at ease, knowing she had taken control of the situation. But the truth is that from that moment on, she also knew that what followed would be a new struggle to rebuild her life and face the shadows left by the outcome of that night. For days have passed since the tense night of confrontation at Richard's house. Emma had retreated into seemingly normal behavior, going to work and keeping up appearances, but the underlying tension was always present. She knew that her decision to give Richard and Jake an ultimatum wasn't the end of the problem. It was just the beginning of a new phase, and, like any drastic decision, there were consequences. On the morning of November 22nd, Emma received an unexpected phone call. It was from the Portland police. The detective's voice on the line was deep and direct, asking her to meet with him to discuss an important matter. The urgent tone of the invitation made her apprehensive. What had happened? Why were the police involved? Emma's last words to Richard and Jake echoed in her mind. Fear and uncertainty accompanied her as she prepared for the meeting. Emma arrived at the police department around 10 a.m. The reception was calm, but the atmosphere seemed filled with a tension that matched what she felt inside. She was taken to an interrogation room, a place where many truths were revealed. Detective Mark Harrison was waiting for her, a middle-aged man with a serious look and a professional demeanor. "Miss Taylor," Detective Harrison greeted. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." Emma settled into the chair opposite the table where the detective was sitting. His face showed no sympathy, but Emma noticed a curiosity in his eyes. "What is happening?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The detective opened a file in front of him and began to speak, bluntly. "We received some information that led us to a new investigation. Last Saturday, Richard Thompson and Jake Foster were found dead in a rented apartment in the city center. They were killed violently, and the crime scene is quite clear in terms of evidence." Shock washed over Emma. His eyes widened and his breathing became ragged. She tried to process the information, but reality was starting to set in. The tension he had previously felt seemed to have transformed into something more concrete and threatening. "And what does this have to do with me?" Emma managed to ask, her voice shaking. The detective looked directly at her, his expression showing no sign of judgment, but rather professional seriousness. "During the investigation, we found a series of messages and evidence that link you to the two men," said the detective. "Text messages, phone calls, and witnesses who confirmed their presence the night they were found. We have no proof that you committed the crime, but your presence and your interaction with them are enough to make us want more details." Emma felt a wave of panic, but also a sense of resignation. He knew his ultimatum had been a factor in the situation. She was not directly involved in their deaths, but her words and actions could be interpreted differently. "I just confronted them," Emma tried to explain, trying to remain calm. I had nothing to do with their deaths. The detective made a gesture with his hand, as if asking her to calm down. We understand that you may not have done anything directly, but we need to know what happened that night. Can you tell us about your conversation with them? What did you hope to achieve? Emma hesitated for a moment. If she told the truth, it could be misinterpreted, but she also knew that trying to hide something could be even worse. She took a deep breath and decided to be transparent. I confronted them on Saturday night, Emma began. I was very angry. They had betrayed me, and I wanted them to understand the gravity of what they had done. I threatened them, but my intention was just to force them out of my life. I didn't want something like that to happen. The detective listened intently, taking notes as Emma spoke. He asked some additional questions about the details of the conversation and the dynamic between her and the two men. Emma provided as much information as she could, trying to explain her perspective and describe the emotions that led her to act as she did. After about an hour of interview, Detective Harrison ended the conversation. Thank you for your collaboration, Emma. We will continue to investigate, and if we need more information, we will contact you. For now, you can go home. We just ask that you remain available for future questions. Emma stood up and left the room, the weight of the situation still hanging on her shoulders. The night had brought a new layer of complexity to his life. The truth was beginning to reveal itself, and with it, the need to face the consequences of one's actions and words. The feeling of having taken control had faded, replaced by a new reality of uncertainty and fear. Upon leaving the police department, Emma sat in her car and tried to gather her thoughts. He knew that, from that moment on, his life would be marked by a new stage of difficulties. Her actions and decisions had set in motion a series of events that were now beyond her control. She looked at the city of Portland through the windshield, the city lights beginning to shine as the sun set. The future was uncertain, and the weight of the choices he had made was becoming a difficult reality to bear. Emma knew she would face many more questions and possible repercussions. But for now, she just needed to find a moment of peace amidst the unfolding chaos. The truth was out, and from that moment on, his life would never be the same.